issues there you've picked up. I'm sure we'll come back to some of that at the end. I'm going to move on to our final speaker, S.J. James, co-founder of All Call Signs. It's been mentioned a few times already. So over to you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you to Lord Patel for the invite, and John Bashford as well. Particular thanks to John, who throughout the work within the Portsmouth Military Mental Health Alliance and also everything that we've done in the build-up towards the high-intensity service, has done a lot of work in kind of keeping our minds towards groups that sometimes get overlooked when building these services and creating services for veterans, particularly the LGBTQ community and ethnic minorities. So thank you for that, John. Just to the report first then. I often read, I read a lot of these reports and different pieces of research around the veteran community and mental health, and try to kind of keep up to date on as many of them as I can. Obviously, given the work that we do, it's hugely important. When I normally read these kinds of reports, it's usually a large amount of huffing and sighing involved, and I sometimes sound like I'm deflating. But I have to say that the Trauma in Mind report was incredibly well written, was very sensitive to the needs of the veteran community in terms of their mental health, and actually offered a real considerable amount of insights into their specific needs that I found quite refreshing. So thank you for the report in the first instance. Just to talk a little bit about my background as well. So as with David, I myself am a veteran, so is my business partner Dan. We both served in the 2nd Battalion Princess of Wales's Royal Regiment, myself firstly in Northern Ireland and then in Theatre Reserve Battalion for Afghanistan based in Cyprus. So there's the kind of veteran aspect of it, and in talking about that and looking at this report, I've put a lot of thought into for myself what it actually means to be a veteran, because I spent a short amount of time in the armed forces. If you look at the entire kind of aspect of my life, I spent longer in school, I've spent longer in creative digital roles, but it's the veteran part that I think has created more of my character, more of the person that I am today than any other significant period of my life. And I've put a lot of thought into why that is. And we use the word camaraderie, which, you know, is used to describe that bond that you have with people that you spend a lot of time with. But I think maybe another way of saying that is that with veterans, you have more shared experience. I think I've used the analogy before that, you know, just because you stop having sex, it doesn't make you a virgin. There are certain things that change you as a person. There are certain experiences that change your outlook on life. And I think serving in the armed forces is one of them. So if it's a case of kind of shared experience, then it's the kind of experiences that are different to civilian life. They tend to be, there tends to be a greater deal of risk. There tends to be more kinetic activity. You tend to be putting yourself in danger more than you might in a traditional civilian role. And in terms of that, then aren't all of these experiences potential traumas? So maybe it's less camaraderie and it's more bonded through trauma that makes veterans different to the wider civilian population, which is why this report was so interesting to read, because, you know, only you can tell you what's traumatic for you. Nobody else can tell you what that is. And I think we do need to be so much more aware that trauma, particularly within the armed forces communities and their families, isn't necessarily head down getting fired at. There's aspects of bullying, there's aspects of having issues transitioning in and out of service. There's aspects of not really feeling like you fit in if you come from one of the ethnic or LGBTQ minorities, where you might not always have found your place as easily as the typical person that joins the armed forces. So a little bit about All Call Signs then, for those of you that don't know. So we're a peer support network for veterans and service personnel based out of Southsea, and we're very lucky to be involved in the creation of the Solent region's version of the high intensity service. and to try and inform that as much as possible. We've been incredibly welcomed by Solent NHS, who have been massively supportive of us as an organisation and also as part of that team. So feel very, very lucky to be sat in the position that we're in right now. We were only formed in 2018 after myself and my business partner Dan came together and actually took a look at what services were available for veterans and service personnel in terms of dealing with mental health. It was in the wake of our own personal tragedy. A friend that we served with, Danny Johnston, unfortunately took his own life after a period of mental ill health. And we took a look at those services and thought to ourselves, what could allow the person that we knew in service, the happy-go-lucky young man who was very capable, was in every kind of metric the ideal soldier, the sort of person that you could see doing, you know, incredibly wonderful things. What could take somebody like that from that kind of stoic, resilient man to somebody that would take their own life? And we essentially discovered 3 areas of or gaps in the services that are available today, and we broke those down into services that we now try and provide as part of all call signs and now as part of this wider high intensity service as well. And the first part of that was actually being able to talk to somebody that has that experience, not just of mental health, but also of time served within the armed forces. And it doesn't have to be somebody that was in the specific role that you were in. It doesn't even need to be somebody that was in the specific service that you were in. We've created some wonderful connections in our community with members of the Navy. Myself and Dan were both Army. There's a certain amount of banter that comes with that and a certain amount of name calling. But at the end of the day, that tends to build that network and that community more quickly than the kind of formal conversations that you might have if you haven't had that experience. So we wanted to create a network where people could get in contact with like-minded individuals that had served. And that was where our chat network was born from, which is now manned by over 700 volunteer listeners, all with lived experience of life in the military. So whether that's they've served themselves or they've grown up in military families and military communities. That's the largest decentralised contact centre for veterans in the UK. And that was born out of the back of that need to find your tribe and find your community and find people that understood your way of life. The second part of that was very much where the high intensity service fits now in a way, which was to create a service that connected the dots between all of the different services that are available currently. We often hear from veterans that there are no services for them. And to them, that's true because they're not aware of the services that are there for them. And that's a failing of the system. It's a failing of the awareness within those services to make themselves available to their demographic. And it's also a failing of the veteran community as a whole, which is very much advocacy led. So if somebody else has been through, for example, TILS or CTS and they've had a bad experience, they don't tend to be quiet about that. They tend to talk about that quite loudly. And that affects other people's willingness to enter into those services. And it's the same for pretty much every service that's out there at the moment. So we wanted to create a positive voice that could go out and advocate on behalf of these services, really show what they're capable of doing, highlight the success stories and encourage the rest of the veteran community to access these services if they feel they need to. And by and large, that's been incredibly successful. And that kind of peer advocacy and peer mentoring, it plays a massive part in what we hope will become the high intensity service moving forward. And it's as much about connecting all of those dots rather than creating new services. There was also this kind of this gap between clinical services and focusing on the mental health needs, and then the rest of the whole person that is the veteran. So yes, you might need access to therapy, but getting that therapy while you're living in your car is going to do you no help whatsoever. Yes, you might need access to therapy, but if the reason that you require therapy, if the underlying trauma isn't being resolved. For example, it could be coming from a fractious relationship with your family. It could be coming from legal issues. It could be coming from a substance misuse issue. If those underlying issues aren't being addressed, then therapy on its own isn't going to fix anything. So by working with third sectors, outside organisations, community groups on the ground, everything from armed forces breakfast clubs upwards, to create that sense of community and cohesion and collaborative work, we're able to see a much more successful route to entry into the more traditional therapies. People approach it in a much better place. They're much more positive about the outcome. And as we know, if people are more positive about something going into it, it's much more likely to be effective for them. So that's a really important piece for us. Reading the Trauma in Mind report, it was quite interesting because I think it makes a great business case for the high intensity service. But I actually think it makes a great business case for all call signs as well. If it had come out 2 years ago, I'd have argued that it was written and we could have just used it as a business plan, because it's kind of picked up on those themes in a really strong way. So the ones that kind of stood out for me is lived experience is so important. But lived experience has its limitations as well. So the one that I always kind of give as an example, people come to me and they say, my therapist can't help me because they've not served in the British Armed Forces. They don't understand where I'm coming from. And while that's kind of, I understand that point of view, I also understand that, you know, to become a therapist, to become somebody that's very useful and can understand the mind and everything else, it takes a lot of training, it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of education, it takes a lot of experience in its own right. So the chances are that you're not going to have enough people that have done a full career in the armed forces and have undergone those education pieces and those training pieces. You're certainly not going to have enough of those people to service the entire veteran community. So we have to decide here what's more important. Is actual lived experience more important, or is, you know, education and being good at your job as a therapist more important? While you might prefer a veteran, you certainly don't want me sitting there and trying to kind of diagnose you, because it's not going to end well for either of us. So what I do think is important is that anybody that is front-facing with veterans, anyone that has a front-facing role, needs to have undergone some kind of veteran awareness training in some format to make sure that they understand the unique presentations that veterans have, to make sure they understand the unique look of life that veterans have, and to actually, even down to the vernacular. If you serve in the Navy, you use a completely different language than you do if you served in the Army, and likewise for the RAF. So understanding what those different terminologies are, what the vernacular is going to enable you to listen to that person telling their story without having to interrupt so often and ask, what does that mean? What does that mean? What do you mean by this? And allow that person to actually tell their story. And what I'd like to see as well, and I think it's been brought out in the report, and it's certainly been brought out in our kind of research into what the high intensity service has to be, is that when you're telling that story, you really only want to be telling it once, and you only really want to be telling it to the person that's going to be able to help you unpack that trauma and actually make sense of it. I think because of the way that the veteran space at the moment is split into different organisations and third sectors are involved, often before the veteran even reaches the person who is going to be able to help them unpack their trauma, it's not uncommon to have heard that they've had to tell their story in quite significant detail 3, 4, 5 times. And as Mahdi mentioned earlier, you know, that can actually contribute towards compounding that trauma and making it even harder to deal with, and can actually in itself be a trigger. So we need to make sure that where possible, we have that trusted assessor model where we can all work together and agree that one assessment, one telling of that story is enough to then go on and diagnose somebody and get them the help that they need. It needs to continue being this collaborative piece that we're seeing more and more. These things don't work in silos, they don't work in isolation, they have to be joined up. If a civilian walks into his GP and asks for help with a mental health issue, then a pathway is quite clear. Obviously, that's not as clear for veterans because so many different organisations, third sectors, the NHS, specific arms of the NHS that have been designed for veterans are involved. as much as possible, we need to make sure that those transfers into different services are as invisible as possible to the end user, to make sure that they feel like everybody is working towards one common goal, and they're able to get the help that they need. And again, it's that no wrong door outlook, making sure that wherever somebody comes into the system, they're getting guided towards the best place for them, and we don't kind of hold on to people that we might not be best placed to look after. We make sure that we work as a team to get them to the place and the team that is best placed to look after them. And one that I'm just constantly being reminded of by John, and I'm very glad that he is that this needs to be inclusive. I think a lot of the time when we design these systems and services, we very much have that kind of 6 foot tall white man, stoic, doesn't really talk about the war kind of image in our head of what a veteran is. But veterans and their families are as diverse as any other part of the community, and we need to bear that in mind when we're creating these services, and make sure that everything from the branding of them to the way that we talk about them to the language that is being used about them is as inviting to somebody from an ethnic minority or the LGBT community as it is to someone that looks like me.
Super. Thank you very much,